So we need to create length. And that's a very different form of strength. Now, when you can create more robust, and whether it's in parallel, whether it's in series, of the collagen fibers through a tendon or through a muscle, there is a very significant proprioceptive response that the brain will then have more stopping power, which will then allow, I don't know what the word would be, but you're able to then create more force concentrically when you have this increased ability to resist in the eccentric phase. So if I work on long eccentrics in a bench press where I am 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then somebody takes the bar, so I make that shit so heavy that I can't press it, but I can resist it. Over time, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever our time that we think the adaptation should be in, and we retest bench press, you becoming much, much figuratively stronger on the descent. What did you really get better at? Well, if you're moving really, really slow, we're focusing on the muscle. We might be focusing on some tendon. Regardless, that is a very, very useful way to illustrate how the proprioceptive awareness of better stopping power through the connective elements, the non-contractile elements of the muscle, kind of shifts you into gear where you can just blast off. And certainly working at the isometric when you have the biggest length. Working isometric elsewhere might have value, but not necessarily to see the adaptations of collagen, maybe some elastin, titin, some of these big stopping powers. So you have two options. You can create the very, very specific angles for the rotator cuff that I could think of the supraspinatus because of the uniqueness of where its kinesiology lives. There's 3 different. Infraspinatus might only have 1 that I'm aware of. Subscapularis has 1. Teres minor has 2 that I'm aware of. So it may not be internal external rotation anymore, especially on the supraspinatus, but all of the other ones are the same. But we're not looking to create strength. The protocol isn't low reps. The protocol isn't using just light weight. We're going to use the same protocols we would use to create adaptations elsewhere. If I wasn't interested in the muscle, I'd be doing very, very high reps or very, very long forms of isometrics in the most elongated position. And if it's the tendon, we have to make sure the muscle is slacked out. And we have a whole slew of positions that we can use specifically for the rotator cuff. So it's not just take a stupid yellow rubber band and do this. If you were to use a stupid yellow rubber band, I still probably wouldn't necessarily do it in the vertical, but maybe if you wanted to, and if the band is over there and you're going to pull and pull and pull and get it all the way out there as far as you can't, because no one can really do that. You need to have other positions where you minimize the demands of the scapula, because I don't care about motor control if I'm only trying to work on the non-contractile elements. And that's now, Charlie, you don't care about motor control. It's a different version of strength. Because if the quality of the tissue, AKA it's torn, is so disastrous, your motor control will then be effective in the opposite, in a non-desirable proprioceptive format versus the bench press, which isn't focusing on one tissue but not another. It's focusing on all sorts of tissues, many of which are the rotator cuff. So you're using all of the similar, if not the same protocols, but you have one way of specifically working on one type of tissue versus working on a movement. And they're both going to be valuable. And if you are working on the movement, you do have an opportunity to incorporate motor control and the tissue changes. Hey, probably none of them will actually make the muscle create more force from the actin and myosin at that time. But it'll set you up to go into the next form of force production and or power production, and you'll probably have a way, way bigger engine. All right. So again, lots of different forms of strength, multiple approaches, whether you have this big global approach for movement to create changes in the non-contractile elements versus very, very specific positions. Try them, and then you kind of find out who you are, or what you're passionate about, or what you find is the most useful. And that was a big thing that I was trying to explain, and that I think a lot of people were very comfortable expressing things that when I get a little bit mouthy, I talk about your favorite 3 letters, most of which have utility. They have value, but they leave out all these other components that don't champion what they want you to do. And people felt very comfortable asking. I said, look, these are all things that there's value in that, but they leave out these other parts so that you don't consume other types of messages. But if you had somebody, me, that maybe brings it all together and filters out the noise, but maintains the signal, you'll find that there's a lot of valuable components, almost all of which have a strong subscription to biology and physics. Connective tissue is a muscle, a tendon, a ligament. A nerve is a form of connective tissue. You could argue that the bone is connective tissue, because it probably is. It just has a different recipe that makes it harder. So it's not soft per se, but bone might live in a different category that maybe people don't call it soft tissue. If it breaks, it restores its direction of trabeculae and direction of periosteum and all the different components the same way a muscle or tendon would. But you have a lot of different ways to then harness the biology and harness the physics. And they're kind of all right until whatever you test at the end doesn't work. And that's the problem. Like, we all should have this way of testing. And if it's a big bench press, how you get there, it shouldn't really matter. And how do you judge getting there? Is it just a big bench press, or is it having a big bench press for 40 years? There's ways to get it all. And I think there's ways of understanding the different versions of strength. Power production, force production, concentric, force resistance, eccentric. How do we get that? Is it a global movement, or is it a specific movement? How do we look at the tendon versus the muscle? There's a positional change within that specific angle. All of those things, I think, can be applied in a very systematic way. And part of that system is grounded in biology and physics. And those are two words that you hear me talk a lot about. Okay? Different versions of strength, different versions of force, different versions of speed. These are all terms of physics. So I think I'll probably make a couple more videos of the things that I felt were really, really fun to come out in a very safe way, where I don't say anything that, even though I'm probably a little bit looser in those individual Q&As, but I would tell you, for the longest time, Perform Better, you would never find a speaker that you wanted to talk to. And if they were just walking around, he said, hey, listen, man, I got to go to the bathroom, but if you hang out right here, I'll be right back. To give you the time. And I don't think that happens at other seminars. You don't see speakers at Perform Better showing up and then just bailing out unless there's some kind of unique situation. Whereas in other conferences, they come in, they come out, they're not really available, or it's such an intimidating environment. And I think Perform Better really try to minimize those things. And at the same time, there's a social and there's lots of free alcohol, but the whole thing isn't a party. The whole thing is to get better at whatever level you're at. And the information may not always be at the level for everybody. But when you have this individual opportunities to connect with people that maybe you do want to hear more of, that level can then go to you, whether it's up or down. And there's no shame of, hey, for somebody to be really, really high level, somebody else has to be low level. It's just how it has to be. Logic is also part of biology and physics, I suppose. So hopefully that all makes sense. Different versions of strong. There's going to be a couple other things like this that moved me from how we were communicating last weekend in Orlando.